I took the task of talking about perceptions fairly literally. All of the slides that I'm going to give you are based on data from our most recent polling of our membership. So kind of keep in mind that some of the things that I'm talking about here are actually less perception and more fact-based. For the things that companies are telling us about their experiences in China in terms of cost increases, those kinds of things, that's hard data on what companies are experiencing. But certainly any company doing business in China's market is factoring in what their perceptions are, how the market is impacting them into the decisions that they're making. So that's the disclaimer. The quick other overview that I'll give you is about the U.S. China Business Council itself to explain the perspective that I'm going to give. We represent about 215 U.S. companies doing business in China. So all of the data in this is from U.S. companies. No Chinese companies are among our members. So this is purely an American view of what the business climate looks like there. So with that, I've got 5 perceptions for you that I'll kind of go through some of the data on. Perception number 1 is obviously somewhat fact-based, but also some perception. China's slowing economy and the persistent operating challenges are impacting U.S. companies' optimism about the market. So kind of a way to consider that is, first off, where are companies putting China in terms of their priorities for their global operations? Now, what you'll see in this slide, this is a 5-year snapshot. For most of our member companies, obviously, these are pretty happy companies. They've been doing business in China usually for over about 20 years. But the most important thing to see in this trend here is while China was never the number 1 priority for every one of our members, it has been moving away from being the top priority for almost a quarter of our members to really being among the top 5 priorities. Now, among the reasons for that has to do with what the business outlook is in China. This one, I think, shows probably the most dramatic change that we've seen in many of our data points today, and that is that companies really have gone from being flat out optimistic 5 years ago when the recession was starting and where that market was going to being somewhat optimistic, and you're starting to see those numbers on the somewhat pessimistic and pessimistic numbers creep back up. That's based on a variety of factors, which I'll tell you about as well. Part of it is viewed on what the business climate looks like. Last year was a particularly bad year for companies. There were a number of changes that were going on in the market. Certainly companies were unclear what was going to happen to them with the transition to a new government in China. So we had a big shift to most companies telling us that they were less optimistic than they had been 3 years ago in the market. But what we're seeing here, though, is a steady trend that the companies that are genuinely staying optimistic and increasing that each year is decreasing steadily. Again, a variety of reasons potentially behind that, but this is impacting how they're thinking long-term about the market. Perception number 2, cost increases are beginning to outpace company expectations for tolerable expense increases, but at least at this point, companies are not yet pulling out of China's market. So we always ask the basic question, are rising costs in China a concern? The answer is yes, they are, for almost everybody. The top cost concerns are really, have been for many years. Human resources costs, almost everybody has a challenge with this, but also across the board. Cost of doing business in terms of materials, what your land purchase or rental costs look like, what the taxes are going up. The human resources one, this I know is a sophisticated enough audience that this won't surprise you, but I will make the point that I make to everyone. Many people think of China's market with its 1 billion people as an area where how could you ever have a labor shortage, right? There's that many people. Well, the reality is between the one-child policy and the education policies in China, China probably about 2 to 3 years ago crossed that line of having an increasing workforce or increasing employable workforce and a lack of enough workers. Most economists who have looked at it has told us that probably happened 2 years ago, but it all depends on how you crunch the numbers. But as a consequence, almost every place that you go and almost sector that you're in, companies have problems not only identifying qualified workers, and we're not just talking about factory workers, white-collar workers, people to run your R&D centers, those kinds of things, but they also are having problems keeping them because Economics being what it is, workers can go for the highest bidder and move around in between jobs, which means that you've got not only a problem of identifying a good worker, but then trying to figure out how to keep them. To my final point on this one, though, when we ask companies, again, that straight-out question is, are these costs causing you to either reduce or stop investments in China? The majority of companies still say no. I think there's that probably is because the companies, at least among our membership that are doing China, are in that market to access Chinese customers, be they consumers or other companies, and therefore doing business in that market makes sense even if the costs are getting much higher. But there may come a breaking point in that. Perception number 3, China's legal and regulatory system may not always structurally favor domestic companies, but the implementation of it frequently does. Now, this is a list of the top 10 issues that our companies identified as challenges for them in doing business in China this year. Cost increases, top of the list, based on the data that I just showed you. Competition with other Chinese companies, licensing issues, human resources. This is a list that is not exclusive to challenges for foreign companies, but it is one that what you'll notice in here, there's a variety of areas where there are some challenges that are unique to foreign companies in the market. First one, administrative licensing. And so kind of the non-trade geek way to explain this is, to do business in China, you have to be approved for just about everything. And so this includes whether you're just getting a company approved to do business in China. If you already are approved, do you want to expand, have a new branch office, or open a new factory? Do you want to have a new product approved? Do you want to advertise your product? That too has to be approved. So companies are telling us, the majority of them are having challenges in getting any one of these kinds of licenses done. The challenges meet almost every one of those criteria: new products, expanding your business, even just routine business activities. The best example I can give you on this one, U.S. China Business Council is a nonprofit. We've got offices in Beijing and Shanghai. As a representative office in China, we can get a 1-year license. It takes 6 months to get that license approved every year. So every 6 months, you go through the process, and then, roughly it's time to start again, getting the new documents. Now, companies have a little longer licenses they can get, but that in a microcosm gives you a sense of the challenges of what companies are dealing with. Now, this one I think is an interesting take on this. We asked companies whether there were specific laws or regulations that were giving them different treatment from who their domestic competitors were, and almost 70% said no. There were no laws and regulations that were actually creating the challenges that they were facing versus what their Chinese competitors are. But certainly in terms of implementation, companies are feeling that difference. It's that 70% of, even though there's not a law in place that says that a domestic company has to go through a different process that's slower or that has a higher level of scrutiny, that's what companies are experiencing. They're seeing for the bigger perspective beyond the licensing issues, these are all the areas that companies identified for us as areas where they were seeing that discrimination. So not just licensing, enforcement different. So if you make chemicals, you may have a higher level of scrutiny that you're getting in terms of what wastewater you're releasing into the environment. Subsidies, standard setting, you can read that list. But again, this hits almost every aspect of doing business in China. Perception number 4, IP, always a favorite issue. China's record on IP is impacting companies' willingness to bring their full range of operations to China. Now, I want to start by saying that this one is obvious for you. Most companies are at least somewhat concerned about what the IP environment is in China. We only had 2% of companies who said they weren't concerned. I'd have to do a little deeper dive to figure out what sectors they're in. I will guarantee you they probably weren't in the music industry, software, those kinds of things. But regardless, there are some companies that aren't experiencing challenges. But this data shows you whether companies feel that things are getting better or not. And we actually, for almost, I think, the 8 years that we've done this survey, most companies have actually told us that they haven't seen things getting worse. They're either somewhat improved, so a little bit better, or nothing has changed. Year on year, I suspect the unchanged is still getting better in many ways. But the impact of all of this is this. It's impacting what foreign companies are willing to do in China. So this is the array of ways that we asked companies if they were limiting it. And again, only 22% of companies said the IP environment didn't impact in any way what they were doing. But most other companies are either not bringing products into China because they're concerned that it's going to be pirated. They are not doing new research and development in the market as a consequence of it. They are limiting the number of joint ventures that they're doing in China. Some of them aren't even bringing products in for sale that they've made in other markets. This, to me, is a good testament of the economic losses that China is experiencing because of the IP environment. Because every one of these areas, if you had a strong enforcement system and companies knew that they could do better work in China and bring the full array of what they might do in other markets, is being limited because of what their perception is about the IP protection in the market. The last perception I'm going to touch base is one that's at least a hot button issue in Washington, but one that I think is worthwhile to explore, and that is that Chinese state-owned enterprises aren't the only challenge to U.S. companies doing business in China. Privately owned companies are definitely a challenge as well. So that list that I showed you before of all of the challenges companies have, the big red arrows show you the ones where companies identified challenges that they felt that they were being treated differently than what their Chinese competitors might be doing in the market. So it's the majority of topics on there. The only ones that they probably aren't seeing, that they are seeing the same situation as their Chinese competitor. Everybody deals with cost increases. Everyone is dealing with those human resources challenges. And to a certain extent, all companies that have a product that they want their intellectual property protected in are experiencing challenges in that market as well. In terms of some perspective of who companies compete with in China, at least for foreign companies, most of them have other foreign competitors in the market. But at least based on our membership, the majority of the next group of competitors are actually privately owned Chinese companies, not state-owned enterprises. Only about 75% of them have state-owned enterprise competitors in that market. Now, this is the question that really comes down to it. I mean, you can discriminate in the market based on ownership, but in China's market, and particularly with state-owned enterprises, the issue really is, what are they getting that other people can't get? And so the first question is, are your competitors getting those benefits? And about 30% say yes, they know specifically that a state-owned enterprise that they compete with is getting benefits. But really the majority just suspect that there's something going on there that they aren't getting access to. The types of things they're getting, better financing from the government. That includes through private Chinese banks, so either low rate or no payback loans. Preferential licensing gets back to that issue we were talking about earlier. So licenses that get approved faster through the process. Tax benefits, preferential access to government contracts. You know, these things aren't necessarily surprising, but they are ways that can create an unlevel playing field for foreign companies in the market when you combine them all together. Now, this is the kicker on this. We asked companies if their privately owned Chinese companies were getting the same benefits. And again, the majority of them, most of them said they couldn't be certain, but the majority of them were pretty sure that their privately owned Chinese companies were getting those benefits that created that unlevel playing field. So this is the challenge that we face when we talk about these issues in Washington is you can think through the issues of state-owned enterprises and what might be unique to them. But if you don't address the challenges that are creating distortions in the market for foreign companies that are coming from China's private economy as well, then frankly you haven't solved the problem for most companies in terms of where those perceived discrimination, the discriminatory practices are coming from.